economists argue about a lot of things. Yet many would probably agree on the benefits of free trade, which generates wealth by allowing the free flow of goods across international borders without taxes and other such barriers. Free trade, also called laissez-faire, is a policy by which a government does not discriminate against import or interfere with exports by applying tariffs to imports or subsidies to exports. A free trade policy does not necessarily imply, however, that a country abandons all control and taxation on imports and export. The argument runs that billions of people around the world have been lifted out of poverty by the combined power of capitalism and free trade. We are taught that the world's most powerful nations spurred their advance by tearing down the castle walls of protectionism during the later half of the 19th century, ending centuries of beggar-thy-neighbor economic nationalism, open up new markets to boost the Industrial Revolution and drive forward the development of the middle class.
We had sustainable growth in the more than 18 quarters. And the last quarter, we had achieved 7%. Previous to that was 6.8. Previous to that was 5.8. The effect of this is increased employment. We have now reduced our underemployment and unemployment by 10 to 20%.
Adam Smith is our guide to perhaps the most pressing dilemma of our time: how to make a capitalist economy more humane and more meaningful. In his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith taught countries to concentrate their efforts on producing and selling goods in which they have an absolute advantage over their trading partners. Adam Smith argued that the division of labor among countries enables specialization, better efficiency, and increased aggregate production. Through imports, a country can acquire goods and services that it either cannot produce at home or can produce at home only at a cost that is greater than the cost of obtaining them indirectly by exchanging them for the exports it produced. In other words, through trade, a country can obtain goods and services with greater efficiency by specializing in those activities in which the country has a comparative advantage. Whether you think economies work best if they are left alone or the governments need to do something to get them working, the one thing that can't be controlled is the rest of the world. Fear of foreign competition once led countries to try and produce everything they needed and impose heavy taxes to keep out foreign goods. However, economist David Ricardo shows that international trade could actually make everyone better off, bringing in one of the first great economic models. He pointed out that even if a country can produce pretty much everything at the lowest possible cost with what economists call an absolute advantage, it is still better to focus on the products they can make most efficiently that sacrifice the least amount of other goods and let the rest of the world to do the same by specializing. They can then export these surpluses to each other and both end up better off. This is the principle of comparative advantage and has persuaded many countries to sign up to free trade agreements. Classical economic theory does not, however, always work in practice, and the rules require all nations to sing from the same hymn sheet. Unfettered capitalism across borders still creates winners and losers, posing sharp social and political questions for policymakers where dry economic models cannot help. There are thousands of ways nations can distort the playing field. The most extreme might be the use of military intervention, although far more common are subsidies for particular industries, tax, spending, and the use of the legal system. Trump's import tariffs are the most high-profile example.
President Trump promised during the campaign to get tougher on trade, and today he took a major step by announcing new tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. It has led some experts to warn of the possibility of a much bigger trade war. But at a meeting with industry leaders, Mr. Trump said the U.S. needs to crack down on countries flooding American markets with cheap metals, and he told the business leaders that the move would give them a big boost.
Pretty much all of you will immediately be expanding if we give you that level playing field, if we give you that help. And you're going to hire more workers, and your workers are going to be very happy. They're going to be very, very happy. And again, what's been allowed to go on for decades is disgraceful. It's disgraceful.
The recent rise in economic nationalism sentiments is causing the questions of whether free trade is always the answer to be further debated. There are fears trade deals benefit larger corporations already operating across international borders rather than smaller firms. Domestic producers can be squeezed out by global rivals with huge economies of scale. The argument could be best put by the political theorist Isaiah Berlin, who noted that freedom for the pike is death for the minnows. However, international firms often support networks of smaller companies in their supply chains. Greater trade barriers can make it more difficult for multinationals to operate across borders, meaning they could relocate elsewhere where it is easier for them to do so, directly and indirectly affecting jobs and economic growth. After the gradual advance of globalization in recent years, rapidly outpeaking the progress may cause severe short-term pain. As such, economists continue to argue that international competition stimulates greater innovation and productivity, while warning protectionism can hinder progress.
World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization deals with the global rules of trade between nations. The main function is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictable, and freely as possible. The World Trade Organization was born on 1st January 1995 out of the negotiation under the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade in 1948. And there are 164 members since 2016. Do you know that the highest decision-making body of the WTO is the Ministerial Conference, which usually meets every 2 years? The main activities that WTO involved are in negotiating the reduction or elimination of obstacles to trade and agreeing on rules governing the conduct of international trade. Not only that, WTO acts as administrator and monitoring the application of the WTO's agreed rules for trade in goods and trade in services. The WTO objectives are first, to improve the standard of living of the people in the member countries. Second, to enlarge production and trade of goods. Third is to promote trade liberalization. And fourth, to ensure optimal utilization of world resources. Since WTO practices open market trade concept and believe in fair treatment and transparency, this situation has caused some issues.
Right now, what you're seeing are some pictures of that of riot police blockading the protest. You can't quite tell where that is.
Well, I think this might be Kyle's location, but yet, Kyle, is that another delegate being blocked?
Yes, this is a delegate being blocked right here.
Hence, from the incident Battle of Seattle in 1999, World Trade Organization shows inequality among its people.
With growing protectionism by the United States, many countries are facing the possibility of a trade war. Many countries, including the US, are looking to make the trade balance in their favor and are ready to bend the international norms of business. The trade wars are threatening the existence of international trade regulator, the WTO. Let's take a look at what the future holds for the World Trade Organization.
There is concern being raised globally about the future of the World Trade Organization that works to ease global trade while ensuring fair play. US President Donald Trump's opinion on the organization is a major reason behind the concern. He has expressed his opinion on several occasions without mincing words. Recently, he said that the US has been treated very badly by the WTO. Though he ruled out exiting the multilateral forum, he warned that US will not hesitate in acting if the situation does not change.
WTO's treated the United States very badly, and I hope they change their ways. They have been treating us very badly for many, many years, and that's why we were at a big disadvantage with the WTO. And we're not planning anything now, but if they don't treat us properly, we will be doing something.
Our primary knowledge on Northern and Southern Hemisphere is based on the geographical understanding of the terms referring to north-south poles of the equator. Far from this, our conceptions of North and South in this study is that which views the two divisions from socio-economic, political, cultural, and general developmental status of states. Though most states of the North are from Northern Hemisphere and in the other side less developed and dependent states are mostly in the Southern Hemisphere, the division is not absolute in the geographical sense. This is because while some less developed states can be found in the Northern Pole, some countries of similar developmental status fall within the Northern Divide. Development based on the gross domestic product or GDP and the general standard of living of the people is the major yardstick for measuring the status of states in the North-South categorization. It covers the West and First World. In progression, as developed countries, they may become part of the North regardless of their geographical locations. On the other hand, any country that does not qualify for developed status is in effect deemed to be part of the South. People are talking a lot about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everybody else. Let's start with this graph, a perfectly even distributions of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It is hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now, let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they have accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that is 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So, the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth in the population of India, China, the United States, and Brazil combined. We can also see this inequality geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism, in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they are about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That is a lot of money. The 2018 report of World Inequality shows that inequality varies greatly across global regions. It is lowest in Europe, where the richest 10% receive less than 40% of the national income. It is highest in the Middle East, where the top 10% capture almost 2/3 of all income. The World Inequality Report analyzes trends and global inequality by dividing the global population into 100 groups of equal population size. In regard to the income level, we can define 3 broad groups. The poorest, 50%, the next 49%, we'll call them the global middle class. The richest, 1%. First factor is colonialism and neocolonialism. Colonialism is the process by which some nations enrich themselves by taking political and economic control of other nations. It is being replaced by neocolonialism today that does not involve direct political control of a nation. Instead, it involves economic exploitations by corporation. Second factor is globalization that enabled the North or economically developed nations to extend their exploitative tentacles to southern economies and make the best drive for wealth accumulation to facilitate integrations of southern economies to the metropolitan North. The third factor is international organizations that shape fundamental socio-economic and political policies and practices of the global system to their favor, which help them to subjugating the southern states to dependent followership instead of association based on corporations among states for mutual benefits. These organizations also make policies that empower the North and weaken and make the South vulnerable to exploitation. The last factor is unfair terms and practices of trade. Removal of barriers and tariff as demanded and ordered by the Bretton Woods institution has rendered southern economies vulnerable to the international exploitation and unhealthy competition and domination of local industries. They also made southern states dumping grounds for finished goods produced by industrialized economies and also made primary products and labor in the south cheaply available to transnational corporations. All these factors also being supported by Dr. Justin Hickel, who is the anthropologist and also the author of The Divide.
It starts off with the observation that more than 4 billion people in the world today live on less than $5 a day. Which is the minimum necessary for sort of basic human existence. And the per capita income gap between the global north and the global south has been growing since at least 1960, having tripled in size during that time. So, and this has been happening despite our massive international efforts to give aid and involve ourselves in international development efforts. So the question becomes, why has this effort failed so miserably? What's going wrong? How did we get here? Is that most people tend to assume that poverty is kind of like a natural phenomenon, or that the success and failure of rich countries and poor nations has to do with their internal policies, right? But this is actually a very narrow and ahistorical view. And if we take a broader view, then what becomes clear is that the fate of nations is due largely to the structure of the global economic system, which has been designed intentionally over 500 years or more to serve the interests of a handful of rich nations at the expense of most of the rest of the world. And this was particularly clear during colonialism, but we can see the same patterns happening today in the form of international trade rules, the global finance system, the debt system, tax evasion, and climate change, and so on. And in fact, if we look at the amount of money that's flowing from rich nations to poor nations in the form of aid and foreign direct investment every year, it's in fact vastly outstripped by the money that flows in the other direction. We often think that rich nations are developing poor nations, but in fact the opposite is true. Poor nations are effectively developing rich ones.
If a rising inequality is not properly addressed, it can have catastrophic impacts on a range of political, economic, and social issues.